Dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. In this short video, I'm going to explain dependency injection in ASP.NET Core, or just dependency injection in general, because I don't want to focus on ASP.NET Core specifically, but rather explain how dependency injection works in general and then show you how it's used in ASP.NET Core. Let's start with what is dependency injection. Well, imagine you're building an application and you have a class like this, IServiceCollection, which has a method called getTesters, which simply returns a list of users. Pretty simple so far. But now imagine that we want to get the list of users from a data source like a database or from an API. So we created another class called userRepository, which will handle all the logic for getting the list of users from the database or API. Now, our user service class depends on the userRepository class. In other words, it needs it in order to work. And this is where dependency injection comes in. With dependency injection, we are going to be able to tell the user service class where to get the user repository class from. We're going to use something called a constructor injection here, which is one of the ways to do dependency injection. There's also property injection and method injection, but let's stick to constructor injection for now. So we going to add a constructor for our user service class, and inside of it, we will have a parameter of type user repository and pass it to the repository in the constructor. That way, when we create an instance of the user service class, we need to pass in an instance of the user repository class. So now we can create a user service class like so now, and we have to pass in the repository. But this is a bit of a problem, because now we have to create an instance of the user repository class as well as an instance of the user service class. And we might even create multiple instances of the user service class, which means we would have to create multiple instances of the user repository class as well. This can become a pain to manage, especially if we have more complex objects. This is where dependency injection helps us out. Let's take a look at how things would look if we had dependency injection set up. First, we're going to remove the constructor from the user service class because we won't need it anymore. Instead, we will add a property called _user_repository and make it private. Then we will create a constructor for the user service class with no parameters. Finally, we will create a method called ConfigureServices, which takes in a IServiceCollection as a parameter, and inside of it, we will add a service registration for the user repository interface. Then we will call a transient method on the service collection to register the implementation of the user repository with the interface. Now we can inject the user repository into the user service by simply referencing it in the constructor. When we call the ConfigureServices method, the service collection will take care of creating an instance of the user repository class and injecting it into the user service class. Now we can create an instance of the user service class without having to worry about creating an instance of the user repository class ourselves. Now let's see how this works in ASP.NET Core. Inside of our startup class, we have a ConfigureServices method which takes in an IAP. Let's take a look at the code inside of it. First thing we see is that it calls the ADM core method on the services object, which is used to add support for MVC to the application. Then it calls a transient method, which is used to register a service with dependency injection. The first parameter is the interface of the service, which in this case is the user repository interface. And the second parameter is the implementation of the service, which is the user repository class. Now, when we run the application, the runtime will create an instance of the user repository class and make it available to us through dependency injection. We can access the repository through the itpip configureServices, which is a service that is provided to us by ASP.NET Core. With it, we can access the current HTTP context, which contains information about the current request, such as the user service that was injected into the controller. Now we can use the repository to get the list of users and return them as an action result. So this is how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core. It allows us to easily inject dependencies into our controllers, services, and other components without having to worry about how those dependencies are created or disposed of. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and watch another video.